Ever since Kamala Harris lost the presidential election to Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago, two questions have been flying back and forth in all directions in progressive spaces. Those two questions are, whose fault is this? And what do we do now? The answers to both of those questions are complicated, but I want to spend this video examining the answer to the first question, whose fault is this? Because even though the answer is complicated, it can be expressed very concisely. Whose fault is it that Donald Trump beat Kamala Harris in the election? Everybody's! Being a random dipshit with a YouTube channel, I am neither qualified nor capable of conducting a granular post-mortem on the Harris campaign to determine precisely what factors led to her losing to Donald Trump, or to determine what led to the Democrats losing control of the U.S. Senate and failing to win control of the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm going to take a broader view. I think that perspective might still be useful because, as I see it, the 2024 election result is just the most recent product of two extremely frustrating long-term trends. Both of these trends involve the Democrats, though each in a slightly different sense. Because when we commonly refer to the Democrats as a group, we're actually talking about two separate but related groups: Democratic voters and Democratic politicians. I'm mad at both of them. Let me start with Democratic voters, and I'm not just talking about registered Democrats, but everyone who tends to vote for Democrats or who would be more likely to vote for Democrats if they did vote. That group includes registered Democrats. That's me. I'm one of those. But it also includes voters who aren't registered Democrats, and it also includes non-voters, by which I mean people who are eligible to vote, who could vote, but choose not to. I'm mad at this group because, yeah, a bunch of you didn't vote. Again, that's your frustrating long-term pattern. Our frustrating long-term pattern. We don't vote. Or, for some of us, when we do vote, we vote for going nowhere, not a chance in hell, vanity third-party candidates that make us feel good, make us feel morally superior, make us feel like independent thinkers who don't just give our votes away to establishment candidates who haven't earned them and accomplish precisely nothing productive in the act of doing so. Progressives who vote third-party are part of the problem, but all in all, I think they're a relatively small part. They can play a big role if enough of them choose to vote third party instead of for the Democratic candidate in a closely contested swing state, but here's the thing about that. Progressives voting third party instead of for the Democrats wouldn't be nearly as big of a deal if all you progressives who don't vote at all would actually fucking vote. Of all the reactions to the election from our side, the ones that most have me wanting to beat my own brains out, banging my head against the wall, are the "where did all the votes go" conspiracy theories. Trump must have stolen the election. There are so many votes missing. The day after Election Day, when there were still significant numbers of ballots yet to be counted, it was, there are 20 million votes missing. How is that possible? A few days later, it became, there are 11 million votes missing. How is that possible? Now, with almost all the ballots counted, it's, there are 8 million votes missing. How is that possible? It's possible because there aren't 8 million votes missing. Those numbers, starting at 20 million and decreasing every few days until reaching around 8 million, refer to the difference between the number of votes Joe Biden got in 2020 and the number of votes Kamala Harris got this year. The reason for that difference is that 8 million, or whatever the final number winds up being, fewer people voted for Kamala Harris than voted for Joe Biden. The votes aren't missing. They weren't stolen. People didn't show up. How much more historical evidence do we need to establish that high turnout favors Democrats? It's not just a slogan, it's a statistic. When we show up, we win. This time we didn't show up, we lost. No conspiracy necessary. The real problem isn't the 8 million so-called missing votes. They're a part of the problem, but like third-party voters, they're not the whole thing. The real problem is, if we're going to count people who didn't vote for Harris this time as missing votes, we've got a whole lot more than 8 million to worry about. There are approximately 244 million eligible voters in the United States this year. That's not counting just registered voters. but everyone who is legally entitled to vote, whether they're registered or not. 244 million people. Around 76 million people voted for Donald Trump in the presidential election. Around 73 million people voted for Kamala Harris. In addition to that, a total of around 2,800,000 wasted their time and everyone else's by voting for one of several third-party candidates. Altogether, that's almost 152 million people who voted for somebody in this year's presidential election. 244 million minus 152 million is 92 million. Polling generally indicates that Americans are more or less evenly split between being progressive or progressive-leaning and conservative or conservative-leaning, with progressives having a tiny advantage at the moment. The most recent poll I've seen estimates that 49% of Americans are progressive or progressive-leaning, while 48% are conservative or conservative-leaning, with 3% in the middle whose political ideology is so unique and complex as to defy categorization or whatever horseshit they believe to make themselves feel special, bless their hearts. So let's go with that and say that of those 92 million eligible voters who didn't vote in the presidential election, 49% would probably have at least leaned toward the Democrats if they had voted. 49% of 92 million is around 45 million. 45 million people who could have voted and probably would have voted on our side but didn't. That is a goddamn disgrace. Now, before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that voter suppression is a real thing. It happens, and it matters. Registered voters can have their registration canceled right before an election. The number of polling places can be reduced. The schedule of early voting leading up to Election Day can be shortened. The requirements for mail-in or absentee voting can be made stricter and more burdensome. All of that and more happens every election. It happened this time. It disproportionately affects groups who tend to support progressive candidates, and if you are someone who wanted to vote but was unable to vote due to factors such as those, please know that I am not talking to you. Because while there are far too many of you who were blocked or strongly discouraged from voting, there are not 45 million of you. I'm talking to the rest of those 45 million eligible voters who didn't vote this time, the ones who could have voted without undue hardship, but chose not to. I'm sure many of you had lots of reasons to not vote, but something not a single one of you had was an excuse. I don't see how this is a remotely controversial thing to say. You should have voted. This country would be in a better place right now and have brighter prospects for the next 4 years if you had. We can argue over how much better and how much brighter, almost certainly not as much better or as much brighter as most of us would prefer, but better and brighter all the same. Are you watching with concern and dismay as Donald Trump assembles his second administration? Are you alarmed by his plans to nominate as Secretary of Defense a Fox News host obsessed with nationalism, Zionism, and purifying the military of anything he deems too woke or diverse? Are you outraged that Matt Gaetz, a man so loathsome and toxic that even many of his fellow Republicans have accused him of being a sex offender, is being put up as the next Attorney General? Are you at all worried about the prospect of anti-vaccine conspiracy theorist crank and roadkill connoisseur Robert F. Kennedy Jr. becoming Secretary of Health and Human Services? If you are troubled or embarrassed or upset by all of that, and you're one of those progressive eligible voters who chose to sit out this election, guess whose fault it is? It's not all your fault. I'm not saying that. 76 million people voted for Donald Trump. It's mostly their fault. But if you could have voted and you would have voted against him, if you had, and you didn't, is it partially your fault? Is it your fault to a not insignificant degree? Yeah, it is. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm sure you had your reasons. You think your vote doesn't make a difference? You think both major parties are the same? You think electoral politics is a construct of the ruling class meant to distract the working class with the illusion of control, and the only true road to necessary social change is a revolution which you have no intention of starting and probably wouldn't actively take part in if someone else did? You withheld your vote to punish the Democrats for something? There are lots of reasons. There are no excuses. But hey, I'm not here just to harangue the progressive non-voters. Remember, there's another group on our side to blame for this, the politicians. I'm gonna harangue them too. There are two things I know for sure about my party, the Democratic Party. One, despite our many shortcomings, we are the best hope this country has to address our problems and work toward a better, freer, more just future for everyone. And two, we could fuck up a wet dream. As I've just finished saying, our voters do play a large part in that, but when it comes to fucking up wet dreams, it's the Democratic Party itself, the party establishment, the strategists, the candidates who take the lead. They are the all-time undisputed champions of wet dream fuck-uppery. Here's my question to the Democratic Party. How many times do we have to lose or win, but only by that much, against fucking fascists and kooks before you get it through your heads that running to the right is not a winning strategy? You're not the Republicans. You're the Democrats. Stop trying to win presidential elections by trying to get Republicans to vote for you. Not only is it morally repugnant and ideologically nonsensical, it doesn't work. You might peel off a few here and there, especially if the opposition is someone as flagrantly unfit as Trump, but, as we've just seen, not enough to win. And while you're reaching so far to the right to try and grab those few moderates or conservatives, you're losing people on the left. People who are already on our side. Republicans aren't going to vote for Democrats. It doesn't matter how bad their candidates are. They're not going to vote for you. Do you get that? I wish you would. Every time a Democrat loses to a Republican in an election, the Democrat could or should have won, the Democrats respond by looking at the Republican campaign and asking, how can we do what they did? As though the only way to win is to get the people who voted against you this time to vote for you next time. That strategy would make sense if the voters who voted this time were the only ones available, but that is most definitely not the case. There are 45 million eligible voters in this country who are already on your side to one degree or another, who didn't even vote in the presidential election this time. Harris lost the nationwide popular vote by less than 3 million. She lost Pennsylvania by about 130,000. She lost Georgia by about 115,000. She lost Michigan by about 80,000. She lost Wisconsin by less than 30,000. My point is, you don't need all 45 million. If you could persuade a fraction of them to get out and vote for you, that would be game-changing. I know conventional wisdom says it's a waste of time to reach out to those voters because they don't vote for you, but you always reach out to Republicans, and those motherfuckers never vote for you either. So why not give it a shot? If, instead of being a random dipshit with a YouTube channel, I were a leader in the Democratic Party, and I was watching us lose elections to people like Donald Trump, candidates who are not only dangerous extremists, but also profoundly incompetent and unserious people who ought to never rise above the level of joke candidate, and I knew there were tens of millions of eligible voters out there who already leaned my way politically but weren't voting, I'd want to try and pull a few of those people in. How would I do that? I don't know exactly, but I'd probably start by examining past elections where our side won to see what we did then and figure out how we could adapt that to the current landscape. In other words, don't look at what the Republicans did to win and copy them. Look at what we did to win. When large numbers of voters turned out to elect Democrats, what was it that attracted them? What was the draw of the Democratic Party then? What should be the draw of the Democratic Party today? Again, I'm not qualified to offer specific answers to those questions, but generally speaking, I think it's pretty obvious. FDR didn't get elected by running as Hoover Light, did he? JFK didn't get elected by running as Eisenhower Light or Nixon but handsome, did he? Obama didn't get elected as George W. Bush with a better jump shot, did he? No, no, no. They ran on platforms promising change, promising reform, promising to use government to help those who needed help and to improve society. They were inclusive, pro-worker, hopeful, and inspiring. They asked people to dare to dream of a better world. They and other progressive presidents established programs and institutions which we take for granted today, but which at the time represented significant departures from established ways of doing things. The federal minimum wage, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act. None of those programs are perfect. Some of them have been with us for decades and still have serious flaws that should be corrected. No president is perfect. FDR ordered the large-scale internment of Japanese Americans, and many of the most significant elements of his New Deal reforms explicitly applied only to white people. JFK was slow to enact his domestic agenda and left most of his more ambitious proposals to be pushed by his vice president Lyndon Johnson. Though to be fair, that's not entirely JFK's fault for obvious reasons. Johnson himself deepened U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Obama fell short of his declared goals in numerous areas, including tax reform, criminal justice reform, addressing climate change, LGBTQ rights, and more. But despite their failures and shortcomings, all of those Democratic presidents left office with the United States better than it was when they took office. They did big things, or at least tried to. And that's what Democrats today should still be doing. You want to win elections? You want people to vote for you, including some of those 45 million progressives who don't vote? Give them something to vote for. You're Democrats. We're Democrats. Let's run on things that Democrats and people who ideologically lean toward Democrats want. Stop bending over backwards to make yourselves acceptable to Republicans who are never going to vote for you anyway, you fucking shitheads. And stop being such fucking cowards. We're Democrats. We're progressives. Or at least we say we are. We're supposed to be. We should stop running from that. Stop acting like we're embarrassed by it or afraid of it and start owning it. Being a progressive is not something to be ashamed of. It means we are champions of civil rights for black people, for brown people, for women, for gay people, for trans people, for people with disabilities, for all marginalized people. It means we're champions of workers' rights. We support organized labor. We support the right to collectively bargain. We support higher wages and better benefits for everyone. We support taxing the fucking rich, not because we hate rich people and not because we want to turn rich people into poor people, but because when people need help from the government, somebody's got to pay for it, and rich people can fucking afford it. It means we're champions of the environment. We support taking significant steps to address climate change and to protect the natural world from pollution and exploitation. It means we welcome and support immigrants, and that goddamn well should not mean that we treat immigrants, documented or undocumented, like invaders, like a burden, or like a threat. There is no more egregious example, domestically anyway, of what happens when Democrats try to act like Republicans than our immigration policy. Instead of decreasing the number of refugees and asylum seekers we accept, we should be pushing to expand it. Instead of proposing to spend billions more dollars a year to keep immigrants out, we should be fighting for billions more in funding and resources to support immigrants who are already here and those who want to come. You cannot boast about the United States being the melting pot, being the land of opportunity. You cannot quote Emma Lazarus's exquisite poem, which calls the Statue of Liberty Mother of Exiles, who says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free while treating immigrants the way they have been treated." And yeah, I know, on immigration, Republicans are worse. That's no excuse for us to not be better. It means we stand strong beside our international allies, but it also means we stand against genocide, even when it's being committed by one of our allies, especially when it's being committed by one of our allies. And at the very least, it means not actively funding and arming another nation that is carrying out a genocide. This should also not be controversial, and the fact that the Democratic Party has continued to support the genocide being carried out by the radical right-wing government of Israel against the captive civilian population of Gaza, and supported to such an extent that many people who would have voted for our candidate this time refused to, specifically because of this issue, is a fucking disgrace. In all of these areas and more, we, Democrats, need to stand tall, stand proud, and fight for what we know is right. We need to loudly proclaim our progressive values and ask all Americans who share those values to fight with us. Stop allowing Republicans and conservatives to control the narrative about us. I don't know how many times since Harris lost that I've heard or seen someone say, well, she ran on identity politics. No, she didn't. She was too radical on trans rights. No, she wasn't, unless you consider expressing occasional solidarity with trans people, but otherwise never even mentioning them to be too radical. She didn't have any specific policies. Yes, she did, and she talked about them, and so did her campaign. But what Harris and her campaign and the Democratic Party in general failed to do was effectively counter right-wing narratives about them that took hold in the media and among the electorate. Harris's campaign was not centered on identity politics or trans people. It was Republicans who said that. Harris's campaign was not lacking in specific policy proposals. It was Republicans who said that. When the Trump campaign spent millions of dollars on ads in the final weeks of the campaign, accusing the Harris campaign of supporting gender-affirming surgery, not care, but surgery for trans children, the Harris campaign chose to respond by not responding. They ignored it. They tried to dodge the issue. They should have hit back and hit back strong, not by denying that they support trans people, not by throwing trans people under the bus, by correcting the lies being told about them, making it clear what they mean when they say they support trans rights and the ability for trans people to access gender-affirming care, and by forcefully and persuasively making the case for the equality of trans people. That's what you do when someone challenges you on one of your principles. You don't jettison the principle because you're afraid people might think you're wrong. You fight back. You stand behind the principle and you tell people why you're right and why they should agree with you. Damn straight we support trans rights. Trans people are human beings and citizens of this country, and they're entitled to the same rights as everyone else. They aren't a threat, they aren't deviants, and we are not going to abandon them to be exploited, persecuted, or turned into scapegoats, just as we will not abandon women, or black people, or gay people, or immigrants, or religious minorities, or any other group that is advocating simply for fair and equal treatment in the face of unjust discrimination and prejudice, because we are Democrats, and that's what we do. For example, so here's the problem with this problem. Progressive voters, or eligible voters who don't vote specifically, and the institution of the Democratic Party itself are both fucking up at the same time in ways that perpetuate each other's fuck up. Who's to blame for what happened in the election? Progressives who didn't vote for the Democrats, and Democrats who didn't give more progressives a compelling reason to vote for them. Each side has written the other off based on past behavior. It's a self-perpetuating cycle of mistrust and disappointment, and it has allowed a minority of fascists, bootlickers, and bigots to gain a disproportionate amount of political power because while we're fighting and failing each other, they're unifying and voting. How do we fix it? I hate to keep repeating myself, but I don't know. One side is going to have to take the initiative and move toward the other. One side is going to have to trust that reaching out to the other side will be worth it. Which side should make that opening move? Well, let's see. That is a very complex... The Democratic Party! Obviously. I meant everything I said. about the progressive non-voters earlier. They should have voted for the Democrats. They should always vote for the Democrats. If they did reliably and consistently vote for the Democrats, it would almost certainly be a better and more progressive party because of it. I am not accepting excuses from progressives who didn't vote for the Democrats, but at the end of the day, it is the party that fields the candidates. It's the party that sets the agenda. It's the party that directs the campaign. So, to both Democratic-leaning eligible voters and the Democratic Party, I say this: get your shit together. But to the Democratic Party itself, I also say this: you first.